one of the things that got me into podcasting in the very beginning was the help from somebody to get me through, but also the fact that I used to write a lot of blog articles and create information. And I've always been somebody who has been creative in a way and wanting to say something and having something to say, but I found myself writing all these articles and getting them 90% finished, but never publishing them. And I don't know if you've ever done that, but, created something and had something to say and then got it to the point where it was, it may not sound professional. You read it back and every time I read back an article, depending on the mood that I was in, depended on the way that I took that information. And so it was one of those things I struggled with for a long period of time, publishing my articles, because if somebody was in a bad mood, they might read that in a bad way. If they were in a good mood, they'd read it in a good way. And getting information across, I found very difficult. And then after being an avid listener of podcasts, I realized that, hey, if I just was authentically me and spoke my voice, then that's going to be okay and good enough. And that was one of the mental hurdles I got through at the beginning, at the very beginning, that got me into podcasting. So as Luke mentioned, I was hosting the Goals-Based Advice podcast since 2017, late 2017, and just been doing a number of podcasts since then, and really enjoyed talking to financial advisors. That my podcast is generally for financial advisors. I'm currently the host of the XY Advisor podcast as well, which is for financial advisors, generally here in Australia, but it's global in the fact that human beings are human beings, clients are clients all around the world. Some of the products and the rules and regulations are different. We're going through a massive amount of change here in Australia, which is a topic of conversation, but I generally try and keep the podcast to something that is positive and upbeat. So thank you for having me. Thank you for turning up and attending. I really want to get to know everybody. Please feel free to throw some information in there. If you can't understand me, tell me to slow down. That's fine. If you've got any comments, dive in. I'm more than happy to make this a conversation, not just a one-way street. So some of the things I've prepared for today is we've got a whole lot of reasons why I believe that financial advisors and financial planners should be podcasting. And then we might run through some of the how-tos and the technical stuff after that. Let's take that away. Luke, did you want to make this a conversation? You happy to join in, or do you want me just to dive straight into some of these reasons?
Yeah, please go ahead and dive in, but I'll ask some questions here and there, and we'll intersperse any questions from anyone in the audience. Please post your questions in chat or raise your hand, and we can address any questions and definitely make it a conversation as much as we can.
Yeah, fantastic. So I think the biggest thing for me around starting a podcast is that it's really around finding your tribe. And this is podcasts have an amazing effect of weeding out those people who aren't necessarily interested in you or your practice or your beliefs or your values, especially if your values around something like ESG, helping your clients find appropriate investments that align with their values when it comes to, social governance or anything to do with their ethical investment portfolio. So I think it's an amazing form of pull marketing where you're just out there providing helpful content to your very best client. And I would always suggest that when people start a podcast, they start a podcast for one single person, not to be Joe Rogan or to have millions of people following him, but to think about this from your best client's point of view and say, I'm going to start a podcast for my single best client, because what will happen is you will attract other clients just like that. So whenever I talk to financial advisors about starting a podcast, I start with the avatar conversation and saying, who is your best client? A typical marketing conversation. Who is your best client? Why are they your best client? What are their problems? How can you help them solve those problems? And in a way, putting them at the hero of the story, not necessarily putting yourself at the hero of the story. So I think that's probably the biggest one, the biggest reason. It's really around attracting like-minded clients to your business, and also doing it for your existing clients, because what will happen is your existing clients will then start listening as well. So do it for your existing clients, do it for your number one client, and you will attract those people. I think another reason.
Yeah, just pausing for 1 second there. If some of us probably have a great idea of who our ideal clients are, do you have any advice for if we don't know how to define that question? What are some ways we can go about defining who our ideal client is for our podcast?
Yeah, I would start with your business, because I mean, I think the podcast is a part of your business. It's not a business. And I would start with your business ideal client. To me, that's around looking within yourself at your own values and who you enjoy helping the most. What are the things that light you up about helping this particular person? You know, what's from inside you as the business owner or the podcast host, or whatever position you want to sit in, whatever seat you want to sit in. What is it that you really love about doing those things? Because I think I love the idea that if we find something we completely love doing, we never work a day in our life. That's an amazing idea. So if we find that one person and then we work out what is it about helping that person that lights you up, and being able to understand what drives you, then you're going to be able to have a long-term sustainable business, long-term sustainable podcast, and to be able to help more people just like that. So I always say that from the point of view, obviously with a business point of view, you have to put can I create a profitable business model around that particular client? Am I going to be sustainable for the long term? Is my business going to be sustainable for the long term if I'm helping that particular client do these particular things? So that's always a big thing. But then understanding that and having your podcast congruent with your business avatar, who you want to attract from a business point of view, is why we're doing this. So I think from that point of view, you really need to make sure those two people are aligned. And I always say to just choose one person. It's very hard to focus on a group or conflicting needs, and you sort of can get mixed messages coming out. But if you just focus on that single client, and you've probably already got one in your client base that that you can think about, and then every time you're doing a podcast, all you're doing is you're helping in your mind that one single client answer questions that they might have. Look, I think probably the next reason why I think podcasting is an amazing thing is I'm going to get more into the concept of podcasting in general, and that is it's a listening thing. Right. So, I mean, we're all here on a Zoom meeting today. Some of you might be watching. Most of you are listening. But the podcasting is a listening device. So, if you think about that from the point of view of, if you want to read a blog, you need your eyes. If you want to watch a video, you're going to need your eyes and your ears. Podcast is all you need is your ears. So, which sounds really simple, but just you think about the fact that you can listen to a podcast then while you're driving a car, or when you're walking the dog, or doing exercise, or all these other things. So you can replace, people can replace music or radio stations, all those sorts of things with podcasts in their life, and it can become a long form content, which I'll get into in a minute. So I think just the idea of what's required from the end user or the client. So if we think about, a client experience or a user experience, what's required from the end user is minimal. I'm not asking you to give me your full attention. I'm just asking you to give me some of your attention, and I'm going to make it really easy. You can still use your eyes to see what's going on around you or do other things. We fall into these habits. Once we've done things as human beings, we fall into habits like let's say we go to the gym and we just end up doing the next thing and doing the next thing and doing the next thing, or we just end up, if we're mowing the lawns, we just keep going until it's finished, right? We just sort of, we have these pre-programmed things that we do, or we're walking or commuting, we just get to work or we get to where we need to be. And so we use our eyes for those things, but we're not necessarily focusing on all the individual aspects of what we see along our journey. But with a podcast in your ears, it's just that. It's a lot easier to consume than if you need your eyes. So I think that's another reason why podcasting is such a great experience for consumers. And just on that, if we go a little bit deeper into that, it's really is time in somebody's head. And that sounds it sounds a bit weird, but literally you are a voice inside their head. People put their headphones on or their earbuds in. They can't see you, and so you are the voice inside their head, which sounds a bit weird, but it's also there's that, but there's also that plus the length of time you spend inside somebody's head. So for example, if somebody's watching a video on YouTube, they might spend a few minutes watching it. If someone's reading a blog, they might spend, a few minutes, 5-10 minutes reading the blog. If somebody is listening to a podcast, they'll often listen for 45 minutes of that time. So it's not necessarily about getting your message across quickly, but it is about slow, consistent time inside someone's head. So when I think about building trust, which we all like to think about from time to time, when I think about building trust, I think about you can meet somebody in person, you can hold your hand out, you shake their hand, you physically touch them, you're inside their physical space. From a human point of view, or from just a pure biological point of view, we could theoretically attack that person from that position. So when we put our hand out and shake somebody's hand and they don't attack us, we instantly start forming a bond of trust. Now, when we're thinking about working in a digital world or online, trust, we can't do that. Like, we're all on a Zoom. It's pretty, if I offend you, you can pretty much just turn off the Zoom or shut it down. And then you can walk away and I can't physically harm you from this position. So when it comes to building trust online, it actually takes a lot more time, and it takes more time and more consistency. So if I show up every day for a year, it's going to become reliable. And if I'm showing up in every week for a podcast, I become trusted because automatically, just by showing up every week, no matter what the messaging is, no matter what, and that's how advertising works, right? We know that it's called branding. You show up, you put your brand in front of somebody often enough, they go, oh, that's always there. It's kind of reliable. And you have this deep feeling of trust about the brand because they just keep showing up. So, to me, it's around time plus consistency equals trust. And by doing a podcast and a regular podcast, you both are consistent and you are spending a lot of time in that person's thoughts and ideas because you are literally a voice inside their head. So I think that's a really sort of a deeper concept, but and it kind of sounds a little sadistic in a way, but it's kind of like one of those things that you kind of need to lean into because it's one of those scenarios that, you know what, people get familiar, and you do get familiar with voices. If you hear a voice on the radio every morning, you just get familiar with it. And then if you were to hear that voice in real life, you'd kind of be like, oh, I know that voice. It's familiar to me. And so, we it's just a normal, natural behavior that we all have with regards to that trusted voice because it's been there for a long period of time.
Can I ask a question, Fraser?
Yes.
How long in your estimation does it take to sort of build that trust? Do you have
yeah, there isn't no necessarily right answer to that. I think it depends on the end listener and the end user, because I mean, with anything that's technical or online or technology based, it's very much around the experience that the end user goes through. So, for example, if they are looking for something in the ethical investment space, they may listen to somebody talk about some of their own passions and beliefs and ideals, and then they go, yes, I agree with that. And it could take a very short space of time. If it's something that they're not sure about or don't necessarily agree with, then it will take longer. But generally speaking, I would say, a lot of people, we've had comments that say, I've listened to 2 or 3 podcasts and I want, advisors have said to me, somebody listened to 3 of my podcasts. I don't even have a podcast. I was just on a podcast, and now they've already chosen me because I've heard my beliefs and they agree with them, and they haven't heard anybody else say that. And so that's the other thing too, I guess, in that scenario. If you're saying it and other people aren't, then you're going to win those clients. But if you're saying something that's slightly different or out there, but if everybody's saying it, then I guess you've got to compete with the level of noise that's out there.
Does the venue matter, Fraser, if it's your own podcast versus being on a well-respected, established podcast? Does that matter, or do you really just start from your own podcast and go from there?
Yeah. So the interesting part is what matters is that people find it, whether it's yours or somebody else's. So, a big part of creating any content is that if you spend all this time creating content and nobody reads it or nobody listens to it or nobody watches it, then it hasn't helped anybody. And so the more people that you can get it in front of or into their ears or in front of their eyes, then the more likely that content is to do good in the world. And so, if you're approaching all content, like I suggest, that you come to a piece of content with helpful points, which is what I sort of always suggest. If you can come in with a whole lot of helpful points, which is what I'm trying to do today, come in with helpful points, then people will say, okay, that was helpful. That one, not so much. That was helpful. That was not so much, but that was really helpful. And I really liked that one. So then if you're doing that and you're doing it consistently, I think it doesn't really matter if it's your podcast or somebody else's. What matters is the end listener. And I say this to people all the time who are doing podcasts. It's not a podcast for you. It's a podcast for your end listener. And if we go back to the hero's journey conversation, you're the oracle. You're the one that's bringing the conversation. You're the guide, if you like. You're not the hero of the journey. The hero of the journey is the person who's listening to it. And so your job is to find helpful ways to help that person grow as a human or that person learn something. And if you're doing that when you're coming towards your podcast, you will attract other people who want to be the hero of their own story. They don't necessarily want you to be the hero of their story, which is what we're all after. So I think that that's a big one. Spending time inside people's heads. Competition is a really good point. Another one to bring up in this scenario. Like, where is the noise? You mentioned it earlier, Kevin. Like, how do people get hold of this information? Podcasting has been for many years one of the fastest growing mediums, and depending on the country you're in, somewhere of 40 to 50% of people listen to a podcast at least monthly. There are something like hundreds of thousands of active, there's something like 20 million active blogs around the world at the moment with lots to read. There is about 5 billion videos watched every day on YouTube. There's around 300,000 active podcasts with about 100 million active listeners. So the ratio of listeners to the amount of selection out there is a lot less when it comes to, there's about 3 podcasts per person, if you look at it in that sort of way. 100 million active listeners, 300,000 active podcasts. So there's less podcasts per person than there is, say, YouTube videos or blogs to read. So there's certainly, if you're a consumer and you want to consume some content, there's a lot more noise in the blogs and video space than there is in the podcasting space. So it's a very fast growing medium. A lot of people are getting into them, and a lot of people are now suggesting we've turned the point where people sort of start saying, I listen to podcasts, to do you listen to a podcast? Here's a great podcast. You should listen to it. So people are actually referring podcasts in that way. And I think when I think of the ESG space, I think of people investing for a reason. They have an underlying value or belief in their investing, and they think, this is why I'm investing. And therefore, after they invest that way, they want to tell their friends about why they're investing that way. They want to tell their friends about, I'm against coal. I'm against dirty coal, and we hate it. And then I'm also for green energy. And so they're talking to their friends about these things, and that's why I've put my investment portfolio here because of these reasons. And if people aren't getting it, they can easily refer them to your podcast, which talks about all your beliefs and passions. So it kind of your podcast backs up their belief to their friends, right? Because nobody likes to look silly in front of their friends. Everyone likes to look, like they've made a smart and wise decision. And so the podcast is evidence of that to their friends. So that it's very easy for them to refer your podcast to their friends. And then when their friends listen to their podcast, their friends also develop a trusted relationship with you as the advisor, and the referrals start coming in from that. So it's a lot easier to recommend a podcast than it is to recommend a financial advisor, if that makes sense.
It seems like there is some credibility that goes with being a podcaster generally. If it is still a relatively newer medium, people don't expect that anyone just does a podcast. Would you say is that true? There's additional credibility or expertise from being a podcaster?
Yeah, I would say yes, in the same way as you could say I'm an author of a book. It might be a really bad book, but you could still say you're an author. So it does get you a step in. I guess you get you a step in. But if people listen to your podcast and you're not being helpful to them, they won't stick around. They'll be like, that's great. You're talking about yourself or you're doing that. Good for you, but they might leave again. So really is from that point of view of, again, if you're working on the content of your podcast and you're being not critical, but just strict on yourself to the guidelines and parameters as to what you're trying to do when you're producing content, is you really want to make that journey again about the client. So about the hero of the real hero of the story, which is their story and they're the hero of it. And so if you come back to the concept of, yes, there is credibility in you saying, I'm a podcast host, for sure, absolutely, because they can go back and they can listen to the content that you've created and they can judge you in the comfort of their own home without having to look at you. So it's very easy. When it comes to being in front of a client and looking them in the eye, it's a position that they would feel like it's harder for them to judge you or say nasty things about you, right? But with a podcast or with a blog or something like that, it's easier. Content's easier. It's easier to delete an email than it is to cancel an appointment. Tell somebody you can't make the appointment. So it's just one of those scenarios. But so you really do have to. You get the credibility of being a podcast host, yes, and you get the credibility of being a podcast host over a long period of time. Like if you think of all the really successful.
Fraser, are you there? I think you froze. Kevin, can you hear Fraser?
No. Hold on here.
Let's see if we can figure out what happened. Fraser, are you there? And
Sorry.
a few questions come in. If we could maybe just start with a couple of those and then get back on track. The first one from Jeffrey, so many options to choose from. How would a new podcaster effectively market the program? If you could touch on that a little bit, please.
So how would a podcaster effectively
market the program?
A new podcaster.
Marketing a new podcast?
Yes.
Yeah. So the way that I would do that is starting with your existing client base. The very first thing, start a podcast for your as I said before, your existing or your best client. Let your clients know that you have a podcast is the first one. Update your LinkedIn profiles and those sorts of things as well. Put it on your website. Get it out there. The thing about a podcast is, again, if I think of the compound interest curve, think of compound interest not as in dollar signs, but interest in your podcast. Right? So most of the time, podcasts don't start off with 1 million listeners the first episode, but it does snowball, and the compound interest curve counts when it comes to a long-term consistency of marketing. So it's not a overnight flash in the pan marketing campaign. It is a slow and steady and consistent marketing campaign that creates listeners and interest in your podcast over a long period of time, which compounds. So start with your existing clients, let them know that you have a podcast, let them know that you're answering a lot of questions that come up from your existing clients. And as they get questions, they come up. And then keep a bit of a question bank. For example, if you're talking about a particular social issue on one podcast, make that known that that's episode number 16. So link those two together. So if there's an FAQ about that thing again, people can go and listen to episode 16. Then and go and so on and so forth. And your podcast could be, some of it's about client interviews, some of it's about asking questions or answering questions that other clients might have. So I think, and bringing your natural beliefs across, which is also important. Even though I said the story is about the end consumer, you also do need to make sure you're getting your investment philosophies or the philosophies of how you run your business across in the conversation. Being So when I say, so I'll continue with that question. So that's a long-term social media. So for example, every time you produce an episode, you should be promoting it all through your socials, looking at different ways of having conversations about it, tagging in the people who are involved in that episode, trying to get people to like and share that and comment on the particular episodes. That will just bring more and more attention to the podcast itself over a period of time. So, you can promote podcast with paid advertising, but I think a podcast is not necessarily a business per se. It costs money to produce a podcast. It costs money to promote a podcast. So I'd be using the channels that were free to start with. That just took a little bit of your time, but also the people that are involved in the podcast. If you do interview somebody on the podcast, before they get on the podcast, talk to them about what happens afterwards, about the promotion of that particular episode, and get them to help them promote it. If you do end up with sponsors of your podcast, then you can obviously talk to your sponsors about how they're going to, help promote the podcast as well. So promoting it again, it's a constant. It's not just a one-off. It's want to make sure that there's that consistency across promoting it as well as the consistency across producing it. And then once you do that, then you again just the compound interest curve. The first 3, 4, 5, 10 episodes is not going to be anywhere near as much as the future episodes. In 1 year from now, the episodes are going to be way more than they were. In 3 years from now, the episodes are going to be a heck of a lot more than they were in the first year. So think of that compound interest curve when it comes to promoting your podcast.
On that compound interest curve, Fraser, I'm just thinking about the learning curve that it requires to get started during the first initial stages, episode 1 through whatever 5 or 6 or whatever number. What does that time commitment look like to get going with the first episode and with those first few episodes?
Yeah, I would say the learning curve is a bit like looking at paying down a mortgage curve. That whole starts a lot to do at the beginning, and then by the time you get into it, it becomes like riding a bike. It becomes habit, and you put less effort into it. The amount of effort that's required. So, look, there are a lot of things. There are a lot of things to put in place, but they're all small things, and a lot of the time I see. The problem is it holds people up or stops people because they don't know. We don't know what we don't know, and we're walking into a sort of an unknown at this point. And there's always a concern that we're going to look bad or sound bad and sound silly, and people sort of put that, I need to be the utmost professional and can't sound, et cetera. What that does is it actually tarnishes a little bit of your authenticity. So I'm a big believer in the idea of authenticity over professionalism. And when I say that, I know we all behave professionally. That's the job. That's what we do. But people, your clients also want to believe that you are a real human being. And real human beings, we all get up in the morning, and we all have good days and bad days, and we all, we're human beings. It's not about making mistakes, but we can't pretend we're a completely polished human being with no flaws. We all get wrinkles, like we all get lines in it. It's just the way we are. So the idea about leaning into the authenticity rather than professionalism helps you overcome a lot of the progress over professionalism type stuff. So otherwise nothing would get published, and if nothing gets published, you're not actually helping anybody. If you've got a whole lot of helpful things to say and you don't say them, or you say them and you don't publish them, then it doesn't help anybody. And so your professionalism has actually stopped people from getting to where they need to be.
Do you have any advice for looking at what is the right level of trying it, just getting to a point where it's authentic and human versus refining? And when do you know when enough is enough with that first few episodes and it's good enough to put it out there?
Yeah. So if you've ever been in a meeting with your ideal client, I think that's the level. I mean, if you're having a conversation with that ideal client and you're helping them and it lights you up inside because you're helping them, then that is the level of the podcast. You don't need to be more or less professional than that. When you're sitting in front of somebody and you're having a conversation, they're looking at you, they can hear you, what comes out of your mouth is what comes out of your mouth. So there is no that's your benchmark, I guess, right? So if you've got an ideal client in mind, and that requires you to swear like a trooper, then that's what you do, right? That's the level. If you've got an ideal client in mind who would walk out of the room if you did that, then you don't do that, right? That's your level, because it's just about going, okay, this is the person I want to help the most. This is the authenticity level that I need to be at. I'm congruent with that, which generally you are, because you've worked out who your ideal client is based on what lights you up inside, not necessarily what you think somebody else's ideal client might be.
Is that the phrase there in Australia, is swear like a trooper? It's a little bit different here in the US.
What do you say? What would you say in the US?
Swear like a sailor, I think, is
Yeah.
probably more widely.
Swear like a sailor. There you go. Yeah.
I was going to ask, do you get feedback on the first iteration of a podcast, or do you get input on, so it's not just you deciding, yeah, this is good enough to put out there, are there resources to get feedback on it?
Yeah, so the way that you and that's a really good question. Getting feedback is a great way to grow, because a bit like the first interview you do or the first client meeting you do, there's always things that you can improve on, and getting having trusted people in your corner that you're willing to sit down and say, hey, what do you think I could have done better? It's a great way to grow, whether it's podcasting or client meetings or the role playing or whatever it might be. So it's a fantastic way to improve. But then also there's a bit of self improvement in your own right. You can study good presenters or good interviews or whatever it might be, and you can always get better. Same with public speaking. Same with any sort of presentation. Same with writing or copywriting. You can always get better at honing your craft. And understand that it is a craft that you can hone. And again, if you put your perfect hat on, then you like to think that everything's perfect and you can't get better. But yeah, you will naturally absolutely get better the more you do it, because you become, again, like riding a bike, it becomes a habit, and then you become comfortable with the level you're at, and then you can improve your own level.
Yeah. Switching gears here for a second, we have a question about compliance. Are you familiar with compliance issues, or is it best to check with an organization or a broker dealer for any particular rules?
Yeah, so that's a really good point and a great topic to lean into. Compliance in Australia is extremely strict. We have a thing called best interest duty. It's like a fiduciary. You've got to act in the best interest of your client. You've also got to be very careful in the way you provide personal advice, personal financial product advice. And if you're perceived to providing personal financial product advice without the rigor of what we call a statement of advice, which is a long document recommending why that particular product is good for the client. And so it's absolutely a concern for compliance teams to be thinking about producing content in any particular form, whether it be written or podcast or video. So there's a few different things here. One is, if you're producing content that is, you don't know who the end listener is, the exact end listener, and what they're going to do with it. From a compliance point, it's not necessarily considered to be personal advice, but then also you've got the fact that, and I would encourage everyone to do this, is to create episodes and send them to your compliance team. One, because then they're going to learn pretty quickly that you're not out there spruiking a particular product without in the wrong way or outside the realms. You generally know what your own compliance regimes are, and so you must stick within them, obviously. And have you can have disclaimers saying, obviously, this information is not personal. I don't know your circumstances of the people who are listening to this. It's not required to download a podcast for me to know your personal circumstances. So, obviously, you talk about things in general format. But I would also encourage people to lean into this and to provide lots of copies of your podcast to your compliance team. in fact, get your compliance team on your podcast, talking about the rules and regulations, because that actually makes them feel safe. And because remember, you can think about, your end user feeling safe, well, your compliance team want to feel safe as well. And so by you giving them episodes and giving them to be involved in the episodes, they then work out pretty quickly that you're not silly, that you know where the rules are and you're not going to overstep the boundaries. So when I've worked with advisors here in Australia on that thing, it turns out they actually form very deep, trusted relationships with their compliance teams within their licensing regimes. And that licensing regime may not, they might just be a number, a smaller number of an advisor with less, they're not one of the big hitting advisors that get all the attention. But soon enough, everybody in head office gets to know that person because of the podcast. So the podcast has actually worked in favor of the compliance. So when it comes to compliance and audits down the track, these advisors are getting, I wouldn't say better, but just that the compliance team are walking in with an attitude of, we already trust this advisor. So that, that trusted position of, again, growing trust with your end listener is fantastic, but it also grows trust with the compliance team. And again, I've spoken to advisors that have had referrals out of that situation where the head office team has referred that advisor as a good advisor to their friends and family because they've been listening to the podcast, and they're working with hundreds of other planners around the country. So it's I actually like the idea of leaning into that compliance thing and oversharing the idea of the podcast, not trying to get away with it, but like go forth and use that as a way to build a great relationship with your compliance team.
Well, that makes sense. One last question here so far is, do you think that producing a podcast generates the best visibility effort ratio? That makes sense?
Yes. Yeah. So yes, like anything, when you start with, you put more effort in, right? So when you first start a podcast, you take a bit of time and you spend a bit more time on it. But that content that you're creating, again, when you think of the compound interest in your podcast, then you're doing the same amount of effort for way more attention or way more interest. And so you get to the point where, you put an hour of your time into creating a podcast. And let's say we get 3 people listen to it. Right? So you put an hour of your time in, you get 3 people listen to it. You think of that yourself, well, that's like me having a meeting with 3 people in the room, and there's 4 of us, which is fine. It seems reasonable for me to do that. And then you do that same thing, and there's 30 people, and then there's 300 people, and then there's 3,000 people, and then there's 30,000 people, which is like a sports stadium full of people listening to you speak for an hour. Now, if you were going to do a presentation, I'm going to say, I want you to do a presentation at a local conference center. There's going to be 10,000 people. You put a lot of effort into that. You go, wow, that's huge. That's massive. I'm going to practice. I'm going to train, and you put a lot of effort in you, and you deliver that. And they've heard you once. But with a podcast, that 10,000 people could hear you every week. And then it can become 30,000 or 100,000, or that's the sort of scale that happens with podcasts. You put the effort in based on helping one person, and everybody that's listening thinks that they're that one person that you're helping. So I think when you talk about the ratio or the effort to the idea of scaling, it's such a scalable thing to be able to do, and to have again. Once you've been going and you've had a lot of interest, and you could create more interest and more interest, and people start coming along over time. Please don't think it's going to happen in the first week or the first month. It doesn't. It takes time. But once people start sharing it, if you're creating helpful content, then 100% the time that you're putting in versus the value you're getting out of it just increases, and the value just increases and increases.
Sorry, I was on mute. Fraser, do you need like a show person personality, or how important is your personality, your ability to, generate interest that way, like a Joe Rogan personality, versus if you're not quite as show person personality, can you still be successful doing this?
100%. Absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, I would stick to your own personality. I wouldn't try and be Joe Rogan. I think that's the problem with a lot of podcasts. They try to be somebody else. And there's only so long that you can keep that up for. So your personality is your personality, and you can bring the energy to a podcast, but I wouldn't necessarily change your personality. So within your own personality and your own beliefs and your own passions, and you just think about the energy that you bring to a conversation when you are talking about something you're passionate about. When you're talking about sustainability or or ethical investing, you bring that passion because you have your own belief in it, which is what you want to bring to your podcast. But like there are comics that bring funny behaviors to podcasts. But if you're bringing your own passions and beliefs, then that's what you want to bring. So your personality is what it is. Lean into that, embrace that. Don't change it. Don't try and be something you're not, because you're not going to do 300 or 400 episodes if it's not you. If Joe Rogan tried to change his personality and be somebody he wasn't, and talk about more serious issues or whatever it might be, then that would probably fail as well, because people would see that as not being authentic. One of the other points I wanted to really make, I'm not sure how we're going for time. One of the other points I really wanted to make in this is that is the idea of referrals and testimonials. So testimonials is a really interesting scenario where people sort of say, oh, do you ask for testimonials from your clients, and how's that go, and can we see them on your website, those sorts of things. I love the idea of reviews a bit more than testimonials, just because we're all used to Google reviews now, and the possibility of a review is you could get a 1-star review, right? And there's that whole roll the dice thing, whereas a testimonial, if it says testimonial, I'm not even going to bother reading it, because it's only going to say one thing about you. It's going to say you've done a fantastic job and you're amazing. So, but a podcast is one of those things that every time you have somebody on, have a conversation, generally they'll say something on your show like, oh, you're doing a great job, thank you for having me on, and so you get the people that are on your show by virtue tend to talk about how great you're doing, or those sorts of things. So there's a lot of natural testimonials that fall out of podcast conversations, and they're not derived, they're not asked for, they're just natural. They're a natural part of the conversation. If you and I are talking and I like the work you do, I'm going to say, I like the work you do, it's great, it helped me in this particular way, and I appreciate that. And by virtue of saying that, it is a testimonial without saying this is a testimonial. So switch off now. I think as human beings, we sort of we know what we quickly spot an ad if it's not genuine. So a genuine referral or testimonial or review is great, but if it's placed in the format that it's an ad, then often again sometimes it works, but sometimes it doesn't necessarily. So I think another great point around podcasting is just that testimonial type. It's a great platform for people to be able to talk about how great a job you're doing, I guess.
We've got about 8 minutes left or so. Does anyone have any other questions that you want to put in the chat that we can address? I guess, Fraser, is there anything you really want to hammer home before we?
Just on the how-tos, one of the things that we do is we run a podcast launch pad where we help planners produce their own podcast. We're a platform that's not about teaching. We don't want to teach you. I mean, today we're talking about all the reasons why, and I can talk to you about some other how-tos as we go down the list. Our podcast launchpad is not about teaching you how to. It's about actually launching your podcast and coaching you through that process. And so getting all those little things out of the way that tend to hold people up, the how to do this and the how to do that. How am I going to choose my theme music? What about my artwork? What should that be? And should I change the name of it? And there are all these little 1%ers that are. It's good to get them right, but then make a decision and move on. And so we're a process where we say, right, let's make a decision and move on, because you can go back and change that later if you're not happy with it. But your helpful content is not helpful if it's not out there and in front of people. And again, the concept of producing a podcast, a lot of it is habit. And so it can be difficult to create a new habit and start a new thing, and hold yourself accountable, and have all these things. So it's not necessarily about starting a podcast. It's about having a podcast in 12 months from now that has been successful. And where do you draw the line? Where's your measure of success? It's not about necessarily starting. It's about having a successful podcast. And I think the answer to that is you have to start a successful podcast to have a successful podcast. So we're going to launch it. We're going to get it up and running. In our launch pad, we get people through to sort of episode 5, and then we show them how to do it, and then we provide a service as well that says, here you go. If you want to, we'll just do the editing and the promotion for you, and all you do is the good part, which is the part where you get to talk to people and have conversations. So if you want me to run through some of the things that we sort of cover off on, again, there is a lot of conversations around equipment. What equipment do I need? Do I need something that's fancy? And the answer to that is no, not initially. For sort of probably less than $100 to less than $200, say, you can get all the equipment you need, which is a fairly inexpensive way or marketing regime. The big investment are there's a little bit of software that you can purchase if you wanted to purchase software, or you can just do it like we're doing now in a Zoom recording. There's a little bit of time involved in your week. If you're going to do a weekly podcast, you sort of need to put at least an hour aside a week for that. And there's a little bit of money involved. Often there's, maybe $100 an episode or a couple $100 an episode to invest in each episode. So in the production, if you don't want to do it yourself, and I'd suggest that it's good to know how to do it yourself. But if you're thinking about this as a long-term strategy for your business, that you put something in place where you can have, you call it sponsorship, or you call it marketing expense for the year, and you go, great, well, the marketing expense for the year is going to be, I don't know, X amount of dollars per episode over a 12-month period. It's going to be this much a year. Okay, am I prepared to do that? So, prepared to invest the time, prepared to invest a little bit of money in the weekly challenges that come along, as in the weekly editing and promotion, all those sorts of things. So when it comes to promotion of each episode, you're thinking of, social media posts and, the audiogram type posts where you can see the music, or you can see it's a sound file with a still image, all those sorts of things, getting them out every week and having that consistency about it. So a little bit of time, a little bit of effort, a little bit of money, and then, but again, or like anything, if it's a regular expense or a regular time, it becomes a habit, and pays off. Certainly pays off in a short space of time, because all you sort of need to think of, well, all I need is one client for that to be worthwhile for a year. So,
yeah, I know we're running short on time, Fraser. Do you have any favorite platform or resources for actually doing the mechanics of recording a podcast and getting going? Any advice on that, practical steps to get started there?
Yeah, so obviously Zoom is the best one because it's free. The thing about Zoom is you record what you hear, so which is fine because you can edit a lot of stuff out. But if you have lags in the internet, then you record the lag. So you just need to lean into that and say at the beginning of your podcast, when you're introducing the particular subject, we had a bit of a problem with the internet. There was a lag. You'll notice it. And about 20 minutes in, we get a lag, and then move on. So when that does happen, people then aren't going, "Oh, is that my thing?" Or is it they get it, they understand it. When it comes to paid platforms, I use one called Riverside.fm, but there are a number, Squadcasts and those sorts of ones, which I've used in the past as well. So it just comes back down to individual preference and those sorts of things. So there's paid platforms and there's semi-free platforms. You get what you pay for, I guess, at the end of the day, like all those things. But to start with, I would just suggest using the free platforms, because it's not going to be, it's not going to stop people listening to your episodes. You want some good sound quality and a plug-in microphone, but it doesn't need to be professional, high quality audio $1,000 microphone number to start with. Certainly doesn't. Like if you choose to go down that route later on, then do it. But I would say don't spend all the money on your equipment. Spend the money on making sure you've got the budget for the year to get you through that long-term period, not just all about the flashy upfront stuff.
Yeah, thank you, Fraser. This has been fantastic. Really appreciate you taking the time today. We're running up on time. I did post a link to Fraser's podcast launch program in the chat. Please do check that out if you would like. There's also a discount code there if you're interested in. Yeah, go ahead, Fraser.
So I'll quickly run through that. That's the link there, ethos.omipod.com.au. If you want to jump on that link and check out the program, the discount code we have for people that are on this webinar is Ethos webinar, and it runs for 24 hours. If somebody wanted to jump on that discount code, the price is it's actually around $1,300 US, and that discount code will bring the program down to $995.
Awesome. Thanks, Fraser, and thanks everyone for joining. And we'll send out a follow-up note. We'll post this video on YouTube. Please reach out to me or Fraser. My email is luke@ethosesg.com. Please reach out with any questions or any follow-up. I'm happy to chat one-on-one with anyone. Thank you, Fraser. Any last comments, Fraser?
Look, if anybody wants to continue the conversation with me, please reach out to me as well. On LinkedIn is probably the best way to do it. Fraser Jack. Fraser's my first name, Jack is my last name. Sometimes people mix that up, but more than happy to connect on LinkedIn and continue the conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Fraser. Appreciate it. And thanks everyone for joining. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you so much, everyone.